Grief is a canyon. A man can be lost in its shadows forever, or he can find the strength to climb out into the light, led by an unexpected hand. The high desert wind was a relentless storyteller, whispering of bone and dust. For Elias Cole, that whisper had been his only companion for 3 years, ever since the fever took his wife, Martha. 3 years of silence, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the lowing of his cattle. His ranch, Whispering Canyon, was both fortress and prison, carved into the shadow of the Arizona Rockies. Grief had settled on him like alkali dust, dulling the world to a uniform shade of gray. He was a man hollowed out by loss, moving through his days with the grim purpose of a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The vast, empty landscape was a mirror to his soul. He avoided the nearest settlement, Serenity Creek, a place where the gazes of others were either pitying or suspicious. He could not bear either. At 38, he felt ancient. His face was a map of sun and sorrow. His hands, accustomed to rope and steel, had nearly forgotten the memory of a woman's touch. He did not live, he survived. Each sunrise was a fresh indictment, a reminder of the harsh winter when he could not save Martha. That failure was a brand on his heart, a constant, dull ache that the physical hardships of the frontier could never completely overshadow. The work was his penance, the solitude his sentence. The rhythm of his life was dictated by necessity. Mending fences that seemed to break of their own accord under the oppressive sun, tending to his small herd of longhorns, making solitary meals over a low fire. The cabin he had built with Martha was now just a shell, its warmth gone with her last breath. He moved through the sparse rooms, a stranger in his own home. The silence within those log walls was heavier than the silence of the desert, thick with unspoken words and memories that cut like shards of glass. He had walled himself in, not against the world, but against the possibility of ever feeling such pain again. His world was the hard, scrabble earth under his boots, the heat that shimmered over the canyon floor, and the vast, indifferent sky. He had become as weathered and unforgiving as the land itself. People said that time healed all wounds, but Elias knew better. Time did not heal. It simply turned a sharp agony into a chronic ache, a wound that never closed, a part of the landscape of his being. He asked for nothing from the world and expected even less in return. The wind whispered its mournful song, and Elias listened, finding a strange comfort in its desolation. It was the only voice that understood his own. One blistering afternoon, with the sun burning the sky to a white heat, Elias spotted movement near a dry riverbed. His first thought was a coyote, its lean form slinking through the scrub. He reined in his horse, his hand resting on the stock of his Winchester rifle. The heat warped the air, making the distant figure tremble and shift. He nudged his horse forward, his eyes narrowed against the glare. It was too small for a steer, too still for a predator. A flicker of unease, a disruption in the familiar emptiness of his land, made him cautious. He approached slowly, the silence of the canyon amplifying the sound of his horse's hooves on the baked earth. As he drew closer, he saw it was not an animal. Huddled in the sparse shade of a mesquite bush lay a person, unconscious. He dismounted carefully, the rifle held loose in his arm. He saw the tattered deerskin of a Comanche dress, the dark hair matted with dust and dried blood. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, a testament to some recent violence. A deep gash marred her temple, stark against her dirt-streaked skin. She was young, her features fine, even under the mask of injury and exhaustion. His gut tightened. This was trouble he did not want, a complication in his carefully constructed solitude. But it was the mark on her face that held his gaze. Spilling from her hairline down across her cheek was a delicate spray of tiny brown spots, a birthmark that resembled a faint constellation against her skin. It was a strange, almost beautiful pattern on a face marked by hardship. In that moment, a flicker of something long buried stirred within him. Compassion. It was a foreign feeling, an unwelcome guest. To leave her here was to condemn her to a slow death from the sun or a quick one from the night's predators. He could not do it. Not again. He could not stand by and watch another life be extinguished by the cruelty of this land. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on them both. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but barely. His mind raced. Bringing her back to the ranch was a risk. She was a native woman, and the folks in Serenity Creek were not known for their tolerance. But the alternative was unthinkable. The memory of Martha, frail and feverish in their bed, flashed in his mind. He had been helpless then. He would not be helpless now. With a resigned sigh that was lost in the vastness of the canyon, he made his decision. As he leaned over her, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and wide, filled with a wild, cornered terror. She flinched violently, trying to scramble away, a low moan of pain escaping her lips. In her good hand, she clutched a sharp shard of obsidian, holding it up weakly as a futile shield. "Easy now," Elias said, his voice low and calm, a tone he had not used in years. He held up his empty hands, palms out. "I mean you no harm. I want to help." She watched him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her gaze darting from his face to the empty desert behind him, searching for a threat he did not represent. He could see she did not understand his words, but she understood his posture. He gestured slowly to her injured arm, then to the canteen on his hip. Thirst and pain were a universal language. He saw the brutal reality of her condition, the broken forearm, the gash on her head, the cracked lips of severe dehydration. She was balanced on the knife edge of survival. He moved with immense care, uncorking his canteen and offering it to her. For a long moment she hesitated, her fear at war with her body's desperate need. Finally, her grip on the obsidian loosened. She let the stone fall to the dust. It was a surrender, an act of trust so profound it struck him to the core. He helped her drink, her throat working as she took small, careful sips. Then, speaking softly, he gestured again to her arm. "This needs to be set. I must carry you." He moved to lift her, as gently as he could. She was lighter than a bird, a fragile collection of bones and fierce spirit. Her body went rigid with a fresh wave of pain as he gathered her into his arms, but she made no sound. He mounted his horse, settling her carefully in front of him, her head resting against his chest. The ride back to the ranch was slow and deliberate. Each plodding step of his horse seemed to echo the fragile beat of her heart against his ribs. He felt the tremor of her body, a constant reminder of her pain and fear. The sun beat down, and the silence of the canyon enveloped them. For the first time in 3 years, he was not alone in his fortress of grief. He was bringing a life into a house that had only known the shadow of death. He did not know if he was saving her, or damning them both, but as he held her, he knew he had no other choice. Inside the cabin, as the desert wind howled its mournful tune outside, Elias laid her gently on his own narrow cot. He moved with a quiet efficiency, born of years of self-reliance. He washed the gash on her head and examined the break in her arm. It was clean but needed to be set properly. She watched his every move, her dark eyes filled with a wary caution. He worked without speaking, letting his actions convey his intent. He found 2 straight pieces of wood from his kindling box and tore strips from a clean flour sack, creating a makeshift splint. She flinched when he straightened the bone, but endured it with a silent, fierce resilience. By morning, a fever had set in from the head wound. Her skin was hot to the touch, and she drifted in and out of consciousness. Elias knew this was beyond his limited skills. He needed laudanum, carbolic acid, proper bandages. That meant a trip to Serenity Creek. He looked at the unconscious woman on his cot, a stranger who was now his responsibility. He left a bucket of fresh water and a plate of jerky by the bed, though he doubted she would touch them. Locking the cabin door, a thing he rarely did, he saddled his horse and rode east, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. In the town's general store, he came face to face with Marcus Blackwood. Blackwood was a wealthy rancher, a man with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had been buying up land all over the county, and Elias knew he coveted Whispering Canyon for the underground spring it was rumored to have. "Heard you have got company, Cole," Blackwood drawled, his voice smooth as oil. "Hope it is not one of them heathens from the hills. They bring nothing but trouble." Elias stared back, his face a mask. "Just passing through," he said, his voice flat, and turned away. In the apothecary, old Doc Hemlock, a man whose cynicism was matched only by his decency, sold him the supplies he needed. The doctor's eyes were sharp behind his spectacles. "Saw you talking to Blackwood," he said, handing Elias the package. "Be careful of that man. He is a snake in the grass. He does not ask for things twice." The words were a clear warning. As Elias rode back toward the canyon, the doctor's advice echoed in his mind, mixing with Blackwood's veiled threat. The trouble he had brought to his doorstep was no longer just a possibility. It now had a name. When he returned, the food was untouched, the water barely sipped. The woman, Tala, as he would come to learn, was awake, her feverish eyes following him as he moved about the cabin. Trust, he knew, was not given freely. It had to be earned, inch by painstaking inch. He cleaned and dressed her wound with the medicines from town. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, not caring if she understood the words, only the intent. He told her his name was Elias. He told her she was safe. For days, this was their routine. A quiet, watchful dance of care and caution. Slowly, as the fever broke and her strength returned, the fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a deep, observant stillness. They communicated through a language of gestures and single words: water, food, hurt. He learned her name was Tala, a Comanche word for wolf. It suited her. There was a wild, untamed resilience in her spirit. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them was no longer heavy, but comfortable. The simple act of sharing a space, a fire, a meal, began to weave a fragile thread between their two solitary worlds. One night she pointed to the constellation of marks on her cheek. With hesitant gestures and a few softly spoken words in her own tongue, she told her story. He pieced it together. The sky mark, a sickness that had swept through her camp. A shaman who, steeped in fear, had declared her a bad omen, the cause of their misfortune. She was banished, cast out to survive on her own. It was in the wilderness that bounty hunters had found her, seeking scalps. She had escaped, but not before they had broken her arm and left her for dead. Her story was one of profound rejection. Her pain resonated with his own. Looking at her, a woman exiled by her own people, he felt a kinship that transcended culture and language. Spurred by her vulnerability, he found himself speaking of Martha, of the fever, of the crushing guilt he had carried alone for 3 years. He did not expect comfort, and received none. Instead, Tala listened with a steady, unwavering gaze that held not pity, but a profound understanding of loss. In that shared moment of confession, their separate solitudes touched. The fragile thread between them tightened, becoming a bond forged in the crucible of shared sorrow. As Tala healed, the rhythm of the ranch changed. She was no longer a patient, but a presence. Her quiet grace was a stark counterpoint to his own rough-hewn existence. She began to help with chores, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in tune with the land. She knew the desert in a way he never could. She showed him which roots held water, which leaves could be made into a soothing tea for his aches. She was weaving herself into the fabric of his life, and the once empty cabin began to feel like a home again, a place of shared purpose. He watched her sometimes as she stood on the porch, her gaze fixed on the distant mesas. There was a deep sadness in her, a longing for a world she could never return to. But there was also a quiet strength, a resilience that humbled him. The soft rustle of her deerskin dress became a familiar sound, a comfort against the lonely howl of the wind. He found himself smiling, a foreign movement of his facial muscles. He was not just surviving anymore. He was beginning to feel again, and the sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Their peace was shattered one afternoon by the sight of riders on the horizon. It was Marcus Blackwood, with 3 hired men at his back. They reined in their horses just beyond the fence line, a clear line of challenge. Elias stepped onto the porch, his Winchester held loosely in his hand. Tala stood in the doorway behind him, a silent shadow. "Cole!" Blackwood called out, his voice carrying on the dry air. "Decent folks in Serenity Creek are getting worried." They say you are harboring a savage. That sort of thing brings trouble to a valley." His eyes, however, were not on Tala, but on the ground at Elias's feet. Elias's voice was low and steady, hard as the canyon rock. "She is under my protection, Blackwood." He met the other man's gaze without flinching. "And this is my land. You should leave." Blackwood's lips curled into a cold smile. "Your land? For now. But a man is judged by the company he keeps, Cole. You choose to side with them, you might find yourself with no land at all. And no company." The threat was unmistakable, a promise of violence hanging heavy in the afternoon sun. The confrontation had begun. Blackwood's threat lingered in the air long after the riders had disappeared into the dust. Elias and Tala knew it was not an idle boast. He would be back. The unspoken understanding between them shifted from quiet companionship to a silent alliance. The next few days were spent in preparation. It was more than just readying for a fight. It was the strengthening of their bond through shared work and a common goal. There was a grim determination in the air, a sense of two worlds colliding right on their doorstep. They would not be broken easily. Elias took Tala to a secluded part of the canyon and taught her to use the Winchester. He showed her how to load, aim, and fire, how to account for the wind. She was a natural student, her movements calm and precise, her focus absolute. There was no fear in her, only a fierce resolve. As she learned to handle the rifle, he saw not a victim, but a warrior. He was not just protecting her. They were preparing to protect each other, to protect the fragile peace they had found in this harsh and beautiful place. In turn, she taught him the ways of the desert. She showed him how to use the terrain for defense, which rock formations provided the best cover, how to mask their tracks. She moved through the canyon like a spirit, her knowledge of the land deep and instinctual. She was teaching him to see his own home through new eyes, to understand its secrets and its strengths. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their purpose unified. They were a team, forged by circumstance and a growing, unspoken respect. One evening, as they worked to reinforce a low rock wall near the cabin, their hands brushed. The brief contact sent a jolt through Elias, a warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. In the fading light, he saw not an outcast or a stranger, but a woman of incredible strength and quiet beauty. He gently took her hand in his calloused fingers closing over hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of promise. A silent vow that whatever was coming, they would face it together. She did not pull away. A week later, Blackwood made his move. He returned not with 3 men, but with a dozen, a rough-looking posse of hired guns recruited from the saloons and back alleys of the territory. They were men whose loyalty was to the dollar, their morality as barren as the desert itself. They did not ride to the fence line but spread out, encircling the ranch, their intentions clear. They were not there to talk, they were there to take. The siege of Whispering Canyon had begun. Elias watched from the cabin window, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. The first shots came at dawn, splintering the log walls of the cabin. Elias and Tala were ready. They moved with a practiced efficiency, firing sparingly from different windows, creating the illusion of more defenders. The cabin, once his prison of grief, was now their fortress. Outside, Blackwood's men took cover behind rocks, settling in for a long fight, confident that time and numbers were on their side. They would starve them out, wait until their water or their nerve ran out. The sun climbed higher, turning the canyon into a furnace. Back in Serenity Creek, Doc Hemlock was setting a rancher's broken leg when he heard the talk. 2 of Blackwood's men had ridden in for more whiskey, their tongues loosened by drink. They spoke of cornering Cole and his native woman, of the handsome bonus Blackwood promised once the ranch was cleared. The doctor's face hardened. He was an old man, and he valued a quiet life. But he had seen enough good men trampled by the greed of bullies like Blackwood. He knew what he had to do. He was not a fighter, but he could not stand by and do nothing. Finishing his work, Doc Hemlock went to the back room of his surgery. He pulled an old, heavy hunting rifle from its leather case a relic from a time before he had sworn to save lives instead of take them. He checked its action, his movements slow and rusty. He was no hero, but injustice, he believed, was a sickness that had to be confronted. With a heavy sigh, he loaded the rifle, hitched up his dusty buggy, and headed out of town toward the distant echoing sound of gunfire. He was one old man against a dozen, but he had to try. The siege wore on for 2 grueling days. The air in the cabin grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and stale sweat. Their water was running low, their ammunition dwindling. Elias knew they could not hold out much longer. Blackwood, growing impatient, decided to force the issue. From the window, Elias saw him give the order. One of the thugs, a man with a wild beard and crueler eyes, lit a torch from their campfire and began to run toward the cabin, his intent clear: to burn them out like rats in a trap. Elias raised his rifle, but his angle was poor. Before he could fire, a sharp crack echoed from the window beside him. The man with the torch stumbled, dropped the flaming brand into the dust, and fell. It was a perfect shot, clean and final. Elias turned to see Tala lowering the Winchester, her face a mask of cold fury and fierce concentration. She had not hesitated. In her eyes he saw the wolf she was named for. Enraged by the loss of his man, Blackwood himself broke cover, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred, firing his own rifle wildly at the cabin. At that moment, a dusty buggy rattled into view at the mouth of the canyon. Doc Hemlock stood up in his seat, his old hunting rifle looking impossibly large in his hands. "Blackwood!" his voice boomed, startling the attackers. "You call this justice? You are fighting for one man's greed." Several of Blackwood's men hesitated, their confidence shaken by the unexpected arrival. Seizing the moment, Elias stepped onto the porch to draw their fire away from Tala. A bullet tore through the flesh of his shoulder, sending a shock of pain through him. Seeing Elias wounded, Blackwood charged forward, pulling a large knife from his belt. But another shot rang out, this one from the doctor's rifle. The bullet kicked up dust at Blackwood's feet, making him stumble back in surprise. The brief respite was all it took. The hired guns, seeing their paymaster falter, and their stomach for the fight gone, began to melt away into the rocks. Blackwood, realizing he was beaten, turned to flee. In his haste, his boot caught on a loose rock. He fell hard, his head striking the unyielding stone of the very land he had sought to steal. The canyon fell silent. With Blackwood's death, the siege ended as abruptly as it began. The remaining gunmen vanished, leaving only the silence and the haze of smoke in their wake. Doc Hemlock hurried to the porch, his medical bag in hand. "You stubborn fool," he grumbled as he tended to Elias's shoulder, his tone gruff but his touch gentle. He cleaned and bandaged the wound, his presence a calming anchor in the storm's aftermath. Tala stood nearby, her rifle held loosely, her eyes never leaving Elias, her expression a mixture of relief and a fierce, protective concern. The story of Blackwood's greed and Elias's stand spread through the territory, carried by the doctor and the chastened gunmen. The people of Serenity Creek, having learned the truth, left them in peace. Their isolation was no longer a sentence imposed by grief or prejudice, but a conscious choice. They had fought for their small piece of the world, and they had won it. Together they began to rebuild. They repaired the splintered walls of the cabin, their shared work, a quiet therapy, healing the wounds of the battle and cementing their bond. The ghost of Elias's grief did not vanish completely, but it no longer haunted every corner of his home. It had made room for something new, something warm and alive. He would watch Tala as she moved about the ranch, her quiet strength a constant source of wonder. The love that grew between them was not a fiery passion, but a deep, steady current, like the underground spring Blackwood had coveted. It was a love born of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the profound understanding of two souls who had found a home in each other. One evening, as the setting sun painted the canyon walls in hues of gold and crimson, they sat together on the porch. The wind, their old companion, whispered through the rocks, but its song was different now. It no longer spoke of loneliness, but of a hard-won peace. Tala leaned her head against his good shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. Elias wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They were two outcasts, a grieving rancher and a banished woman, who had found in the heart of the unforgiving desert not just survival but salvation. Together,